Have you ever been surrounded by people who carry your same last name and felt completely erased? The laughter cut through the room like something sharpened on purpose. Jade kept her gaze locked on her own hands. Her entire inheritance, after years of being the only soul who genuinely loved her eccentric Aunt Bea, amounted to one thing: a single mirror. Tarnished, dust-caked, forgotten. They called it garbage. They looked at her like she was a joke that had finally landed. But none of them understood Bea's silence. And none of them knew that the most precious things in this world are sometimes buried under layers of deliberate neglect. The surviving members of the Gallagher bloodline filled the conference room, a family drowning in legacy and completely starved of warmth. Jade Harrington sat closest to the door, fingers knotted tight in her lap. 32 years old, the youngest person in the room, and almost certainly the only one who had actually wept when Beatrice Gallagher stopped breathing. Aunt Bea had been fierce, strange, and utterly herself, a woman who rattled around the crumbling Victorian mansion in Salem like a ghost who refused to leave her own story. The rest of the family spent their energy whispering about Bea's supposedly failing mind and running calculations on what she was worth dead. Jade spent her Sundays. She drank lukewarm Earl Grey in Bea's parlor while dust drifted through slanted light. She listened to rambling, vivid stories about the 1960s art world, about ships and foreign cities and lovers whose names Bea spoke only once. Across the heavy table sat Darius, Jade's older brother. He checked his Rolex every few minutes. His tailored Italian suit seemed to vibrate with hunger. Beside him, their cousin Sylvia. She was dragging crimson lipstick across her mouth with the hollow patience of someone killing time at a gate for a delayed flight. Attorney Harrison Caldwell looked like he predated half the furniture in his own office. He cleared his throat, adjusted half-moon spectacles, then cracked the seal on a thick manila envelope resting flat before him. "We are gathered today to execute the last will and testament of Beatrice Gallagher," Caldwell began. His voice had the texture of old paper left too long in the sun. The room hardened instantly. Darius abandoned his Rolex. Sylvia clicked her compact shut. Aunt Bea's estate had been the subject of speculation for years. Old shipping wealth, layered with sharp mid-century real estate plays, and a stock portfolio she guarded like a state secret. Caldwell worked through the legal preamble. Jade let the dense language wash past her. Her mind wandered somewhere softer, the scent of lavender mixed with aged paper that clung to everything Bea touched. She wasn't bracing for a windfall. Darius had always been the anointed heir, the golden son positioned to absorb the Gallagher fortune whole. Sylvia had spent years sidling up to Bea's financial advisors with surgical precision. All Jade wanted was something small: a fountain pen, a photograph album, something that still smelled like Bea. Caldwell read, his gaze tracking through the dense print. Darius exhaled hard. A slow, satisfied grin pulled across his face, the expression of a man collecting what he always believed was already his. He turned and fired a look of pure victory at Sylvia. __, quote _3__. Caldwell continued, completely unmoved by the silent theater. Sylvia's breath caught audibly. Her fingers rose to her collarbone. She had secured the glittering haul she'd coveted since she was old enough to understand what a vault was. Caldwell stopped. He turned the page. Silence swelled in the room, thick, pressurized, almost physical. Jade shifted in her chair. She was already rehearsing how to slip out once the formalities wound down. Caldwell said, his forehead creasing slightly, as though the words on the page had surprised even him. Both Darius and Sylvia swiveled toward her. Darius's eyes thinned. Sylvia looked faintly entertained. "To Jade," Caldwell read, his voice settling into a strangely careful tone. "The one who always saw the value in looking past the surface, I leave the antique Victorian pier mirror currently residing in the front foyer of the Salem estate. Every sound in the room died. Jade blinked. The mirror. She knew exactly which piece he meant. It was a massive, imposing thing, nearly 8 feet tall, framed in dense, dark mahogany, choked with aggressive Gothic scrollwork. The silvering on the glass had begun to flake and mottle with decades of decay, warping every reflection into something ghostly and wrong. By any honest measure, it was an ugly piece of furniture. Then a sound cracked through the silence, sharp, cutting, a scoff. Darius leaned back in his leather chair and erupted into deep, gut-level laughter. Cruel and booming, it ricocheted off the wood-paneled walls. A heartbeat later, Sylvia followed. A high, mocking giggle that slid down Jade's spine like ice water. Quote 9. Darius gasped, pressing a knuckle to the corner of his eye. Sylvia cooed, every syllable dripping with condescension. The humiliation seared Jade's cheeks scarlet. It wasn't the absence of money that wounded her. It was the raw, public indignity of the bequest, amplified by the venom of her own blood. She turned to Attorney Caldwell, searching his face for something. An explanation, a codicil, a hidden account. But the lawyer offered only a glance of mild professional pity and closed the folder. Quote, 14 Caldwell said quietly. Jade rose to her feet. Her legs felt half numb beneath her, but she forced her spine rigid, perfectly straight. She looked at Darius, already pulling out his phone, probably dialing a real estate broker. She looked at Sylvia, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. Quote 15, quote 16, Jade said. Her voice came out remarkably steady, betraying nothing of the storm tearing through her chest. Quote 17, quote. Darius replied without lifting his eyes from the screen. Quote 18, quote. 4 days later, Jade steered her beat-up Honda Civic along the winding, overgrown driveway of the Salem estate. The house looked different without Aunt Bea inside it. The looming gables and dark slate roof felt aggressive now, unwelcoming, almost hostile. When she turned the heavy oak front door, the smell hit her instantly. Dust and neglect, thick as fabric. Darius had clearly already been through. Boxes sat stacked haphazardly in the parlor. Price tags dangled from the antique furniture. He was gutting the place, stripping it down for a ruthless, impersonal sale. Jade walked into the grand foyer, and there it stood, propped against the faded floral wallpaper. Her inheritance. It looked even more grotesque than she remembered. The wood had darkened to near black with age, caked in a century's worth of accumulated grime. The gargoyles, carved into the upper corners, seemed to glare down at her, mocking, daring her to care. The glass itself was thick and warped, sending back a distorted, wavy image of Jade's exhausted face. She stepped closer, pressed her palm flat against the cold wood. She whispered into the hollow silence of the house. No answer came, just the slow, settling groans of old timber. Jade had hired 2 local movers, Dave and Tommy, to transport the beast. When they arrived, one look at the mirror drew a low whistle of dismay. Dave grunted, looping a thick canvas strap around his forearms. Jade said, surprised by the fierce protectiveness rising in her own voice. It was all she had left of the woman who had loved her. 45 minutes of swearing, sweating, and strained muscle later, the 2 burly men had wrestled the mirror through the front door and into the box truck. Tommy panted, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead. Quote 25 Jade brushed the comment off as exaggeration from an overworked mover, tipped them generously, and followed the truck back to her modest 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville. Getting the mirror up the single flight of stairs nearly ended in disaster. But eventually, there it stood, flush against the wall of her small living room. It dwarfed everything else in the space. Her IKEA sofa, her cheap television, all of it rendered completely absurd by comparison. Once the movers left, Jade stood in the center of the room, staring at the behemoth. The silence of her apartment pressed against her from every direction. The grief she had been holding back since the lawyer's office finally cracked open. She sank to the floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and sobbed. She cried for Aunt Bea. She cried for the cruelty of her brother. She cried for the sheer, bone-deep unfairness of all of it. When the tears finally ran dry, the late afternoon sun was throwing long orange beams across the warped glass of the mirror. Jade wiped her face. A sudden, strange burst of practical energy moved through her. If she was going to live with this monstrosity, it was at least going to be clean. She filled a bucket with warm water, white vinegar, Murphy's oil soap. Grabbed a stack of microfiber cloths. She started with the glass, scrubbing away decades of hazy film. As the surface cleared, the flaking silver backing underneath became even more obvious. But at least the glass was smooth now. Then she turned to the massive wooden frame. She worked the oil soap deep into the intricate carvings, using an old toothbrush to dig grime from the gargoyle's hollow, deeply set eyes. Down the sides, around the heavy base. As she scrubbed the thick wooden panels on the back, the part meant to sit unseen against a wall, her cloth snagged on something. Jade stopped. Ran her fingers across the back panel. It wasn't a solid piece of wood, not like she had assumed. There was a seam, perfectly straight, impossibly tight, running the entire length of the backboard. A thick layer of dark furniture wax and decades of accumulated dust had hidden it completely. Frowning, she grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen and carefully scraped along the line. The wax flaked away in dark curls, revealing a series of tiny brass screws, countersunk flush within the wood. Tommy the Mover's voice rang through her memory. It's like it's filled with lead. Her heart gave a strange, involuntary flutter. Why would a mirror backing be screwed shut like a vault, not nailed or tacked, the way normal antique furniture would be? And why was the frame so impossibly thick? The mirror stood nearly 10 inches off the wall. Jade ran to her utility drawer, grabbed a Phillips head screwdriver. She knelt behind the mirror, positioned the blade into the first screw head. Old brass. Stubborn. It wouldn't move. She gritted her teeth, pressed her palm hard against the back of the handle, and turned with everything she had. A sharp crack, loud as a gunshot in the quiet apartment, and the screw broke free. She worked feverishly for the next 20 minutes. Her hands cramped, her fingers went numb. 16 heavy brass screws, one after another. When the final screw dropped into the carpet, Jade took a deep breath. She wedged her fingers into the seam, feeling the heavy, dense wood of the panel. Stiff, vacuum-sealed by time and wax. She pulled harder, bracing her foot against the base of the frame. A low groaning scrape, and the massive back panel gave way, falling backward onto the carpet with a heavy thud. A cloud of ancient dry dust billowed into the air. Jade coughed, waving her hands through the haze. When it settled, she crawled forward on her hands and knees and looked inside. The mirror wasn't just a frame. It was a custom-built hollow casing. The cavity behind the glass was lined with dark green velvet, completely pristine, untouched by the elements, and sitting snugly within that velvet-lined tomb, stacked neatly from the base all the way to the top of the 8-foot frame, were dozens of thick rectangular packages. Each one wrapped tightly in heavy, waterproof oilcloth, each one bound with thick twine. Jade's breath caught hard in her throat. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached into the dark cavity and pulled out the nearest package. Heavy. She sat back on her heels and untied the brittle twine. It snapped without resistance. She peeled back layers of dark oilcloth. Inside, A thick stack of paper. But not just any paper. Jade stared at the intricate, steel-engraved borders, the watermarks, the heavy Gothic font. She recognized them from a finance class she had taken years ago in college. Bearer bonds. And underneath the first stack of bonds, a manila folder containing original, impossibly old stock certificates. She slid the top certificate free. The ink had dulled with age, but those bold letters stamped across the header, those were unmistakable. 10,000 shares in the holding company she knew, without a shred of doubt, had been swallowed whole by one of the largest multinational technology conglomerates on the planet sometime in the early 1980s. And beneath that certificate, pressed flat against the velvet lining, sat an envelope. Thick cream-colored stationery, the kind Aunt Bea always used. Jade's fingers shook as she broke the seal. Inside, a letter. That familiar looping handwriting. Every curve of every word unmistakably Bea's. My dearest Jade, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone. And second, that my wretched nephew Darius and his vapid cousin have shown their true colors at the reading of my will. Let them have the bricks and mortar. Let them have the trinkets in the bank. They are fools, Jade. They only see what is placed directly in front of them. I have spent my life guarding a secret, waiting for someone who possessed the patience, the humility, and the character to look beyond the surface. I knew it would be you. What you hold in your hands is the true Gallagher fortune, untraceable, unrecorded, and utterly yours. Jade's gaze drifted from the page down into the velvet cavity. The oilcloth packages rose in a dense, towering column, 40 of them, maybe 50. This wasn't thousands of dollars. As she began the slow, staggering math, bearer bonds and the original unsplit shares in a blue-chip tech monolith spanning 4 decades, the number took shape. Jade Harrington was staring at hundreds of millions of dollars. For 3 days straight, she did not sleep. She phoned in sick to her data entry position at State Street Corporation, locked her apartment door, drew every blind. The sheer, suffocating reality of what was piled across her living room held her in place like a hand pressed against her chest. One by one, she pulled each oilcloth package from the antique mirror's casing. She cataloged everything on a cheap legal pad, her handwriting getting shakier with each line. The inventory was beyond comprehension. Hundreds of U.S. Treasury bearer bonds, those anonymous, untraceable instruments the ultra-wealthy had favored before the government discontinued them in 1982. No registration, no names. Whoever gripped the physical paper owned the debt, period. But the bearer bonds weren't the centerpiece. The corporate certificates were. Aunt Bea had been an early, ferocious investor during the 1980s tech boom. Tucked inside that velvet casing were physical, unsplit shares of Apple Computer Incorporated, purchased not long after the company's 1980 IPO. Alongside them, thousands of shares of Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock. When Jade factored in decades of stock splits, reinvested dividends, and compound growth, the figure crystallized. Approximately $246 million in paper in her apartment. She understood immediately. She was in enormous danger. If even a whisper escaped, she'd become a target overnight. If Darius or Sylvia caught wind of this, they'd drown her in predatory litigation for the next decade. They'd claim Aunt Bea had lost her mind. Jade needed a fortress. She needed a legal shield no one could penetrate. Thursday morning, she pulled on her most conservative navy suit. $100,000 bearer bond, 1 Apple stock certificate. She slid them into a worn leather satchel with deliberate, practiced calm. Everything else stayed locked inside a heavy steel fire safe, purchased the day before, paid for in cash, no paper trail. She did not go to Harrison Caldwell. The Gallagher family's ancient estate attorney was the last person on earth she would trust with this. Instead, she rode the T to the Prudential Tower, walked through the gleaming, deliberately intimidating lobby of Ropes and Gray, one of Boston's most elite and most ruthless law firms. She had done her homework. She asked for one name, Arthur Pendleton, senior partner, ultra-high net worth asset management and corporate trusts. Arthur Pendleton looked like a man who had emerged from the womb wearing a tailored Brioni suit. When Jade was finally shown into his corner office, he offered a polite, rehearsed smile. It stopped well short of his eyes. She could feel it. He had already filed her away. Small-time client, lost, out of her depth. Quote _ 26 _. Pendleton said, his gaze dropping briefly to his Rolex. That gesture, quick, dismissive, automatic, tightened something in Jade's stomach. It was Darius all over again. My assistant mentioned you have a complex estate issue. How can Ropes and Gray assist you today? Jade said nothing. She unclasped the satchel, drew out the manila folder. Slid those two antique documents across the polished mahogany desk. Pendleton looked down. His professional smile dissolved. He lifted the bearer bond toward the light, studying the intricate, steel-engraved watermark with the focus of a man who suddenly understood he'd misjudged something badly. Then his gaze shifted to the Apple certificate. He swallowed, a visible, involuntary thing, Adam's apple pressing against his silk tie. Where did you get these? His voice had dropped a full octave. I inherited them, Jade said. Quiet, steady, not a tremor in her. And I have 48 more packages exactly like this one. They're sitting in a secure location right now. By my amateur calculation, total asset value comes in just shy of $250 million. I need authentication. I need the shares digitized, the matured bonds cashed. And I need it done under absolute, airtight anonymity. She paused. Let that number breathe in the room. I want a blind trust, Mr. Pendleton. An ironclad wall between me and this money. Pendleton stared at her. Every trace of condescension, gone, scraped clean from his face like frost of glass. Miss Harrington, he breathed, I believe we can accommodate you. The next 3 months became a covert financial operation. Pendleton arranged a private armored Brinks transport to move the remaining contents of the mirror from Jade's apartment into a subterranean vault at Bank of America. A hand-picked team of forensic accountants and brokers went to work, quietly. Because bearer bonds are heavily regulated today, flagged specifically for money laundering, Ropes and Gray had to navigate the Treasury Department with surgical precision. They proved chain of custody through Aunt Bea's letter and the time-stamped, factory-sealed condition of the mirror's backing. As funds began materializing, legally, systematically, Jade established Mahogany Holdings LLC, a completely blind trust, managed by Pendleton, invisible to anyone looking. She quit her position at State Street Corporation, cited personal reasons, but she didn't buy a yacht. Didn't lease a penthouse. She stayed in her Somerville apartment. She waited, because while Jade was silently assembling an empire, Darius and Sylvia were walking straight into a trap one Aunt Bea had engineered from the grave with meticulous, almost surgical patience. Arthur Pendleton had conducted a quiet audit of the Gallagher estate's public records at Jade's request. What he uncovered made her laugh until tears streaked her face. Bea hadn't just hidden her wealth inside the mirror. She had weaponized every visible asset she left behind. Those Back Bay commercial properties Darius had gloated over, Aunt Bea had taken out massive, high-interest commercial mortgages against them years earlier. Used the cash to purchase untraceable bonds. And it got worse. An EPA inspection, triggered by Darius's attempt to sell the buildings, revealed extensive hazardous asbestos throughout the HVAC systems. The properties were legally unsellable until a $3 million remediation was completed. Sylvia's fate was even more poetic. The gold reserves and antique jewelry locked inside the First National Bank safety deposit boxes, every piece had been pledged as collateral. Aunt Bea had taken out a string of personal loans from JP Morgan Chase against them. When Sylvia attempted to claim the jewels, the bank slapped her with a lien immediately. They hadn't inherited an empire, they'd inherited a financial time bomb. Autumn descended across New England, painting the trees in brilliant amber and crimson. 6 months since the reading of the will, Jade sat in the back of a sleek black town car, watching the familiar iron gates of the Salem estate draw closer. The property looked worse than she'd ever seen it. Lawn dead. Foreclosure notices stapled to the front door. Darius's financial collapse had been spectacular, swift. Unable to unload the toxic commercial properties, the crushing mortgage payments had drained every dollar of his personal savings. Desperate, he'd leveraged the Salem mansion itself, only to discover the foundation was crumbling beneath it. Bankrupt and cornered, he'd been forced to put the family home up for public absolute auction to satisfy his creditors. Jade stepped from the car. She wore a tailored slate-gray cashmere coat and dark sunglasses. She looked nothing like the quiet, grieving girl from the lawyer's office. Arthur Pendleton walked at her side, carrying a slim leather briefcase. A small crowd had gathered on the dead lawn. Local real estate vultures, curious neighbors. Standing on the porch, looking haggard, aged 20 years and 6 months, was Darius. Sylvia stood beside him, clutching a cheap trench coat around herself, her designer bags long since pawned. The auctioneer, a loud man with a microphone, opened the proceedings. 34! 35! A local developer called out. 36! Someone else shouted. The bidding crawled upward. 1.8 million. Darius looked physically ill. At that number, the sale wouldn't cover half the debt strangling the estate. He was staring down total financial ruin. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward. His voice sliced through the crisp autumn air with the kind of authority only decades of corporate law can sharpen. $3 million. A bit of silence. Then, cash. The crowd stirred. The developer shook his head and backed away. The auctioneer's gavel cracked down hard. __quote _ 39 __. Darius's shoulders dropped with temporary relief. He descended the porch steps toward Pendleton, manufacturing a desperate salesman's grin. __quote _ 40 __. Pendleton didn't take his hand. He simply stepped to the side. Jade walked forward and removed her sunglasses. Darius froze mid-stride. Every trace of color drained from his face. Sylvia choked out a strangled, bewildered gasp. "Hello, Darius. Hello, Sylvia," Jade said. Her voice was even, smooth, unhurried, completely unbothered. "Jade?" Darius stammered. His eyes darted over her expensive clothes, the private car idling behind her, the high-powered attorney flanking her shoulder. What are you doing here? Did you bid on the house?" "My trust did, yes," Jade replied. "Mahogany Holdings LLC, fully funded. I also acquired the debt on your back pay properties from the bank last week, which makes you, effectively, my tenant now." "Darius!" Sylvia shoved forward, eyes blown wide with frantic disbelief. "How? You didn't get anything? You got that ugly, worthless piece of junk mirror. How are you doing this?" Jade smiled. Not a cruel smile, but a cold one. "Aunt Bea always said you both lacked vision. You only ever cared about what looked expensive on the surface. Never once bothered to look beneath it." "What did you do?" Darius demanded. His voice was shaking now, trembling with a rising, sickening realization. "What was in that mirror?" "Just wood and glass," Jade lied without flinching. She knew that revealing the true nature of the bearer bonds would only invite years of exhausting litigation. Lawsuits she would ultimately win, but ones that would bleed her dry of peace. "But Aunt Bea left me a letter tucked behind the frame. It contained access codes to her offshore accounts. Accounts she built by quietly mortgaging the properties and jewelry she left to you. The lie was cleaner than the truth, and infinitely more devastating. Darius staggered backward as if something had struck him in the chest. He looked up at the crumbling facade of the house, then back at his sister. The full weight of his own arrogant stupidity came crashing down. He had literally laughed at her as she walked out the door, carrying the key to $250 million. Sylvia broke apart, loud, ugly sobs. Pure, unadulterated regret pouring out of her with no dignity left to contain it. You have until the end of the week to clear your personal belongings from the house, Darius, Jade said, already turning toward the waiting town car. She paused, looked back over one shoulder. Oh, and if you need a truck to haul your things to the dump, I suppose I could lend you a few dollars. She didn't stay to watch them crumble. She climbed into the backseat. Pendleton shut the door firmly behind her. The car pulled away, rolling smoothly down the overgrown driveway. Jade gazed through the tinted glass at the old Victorian mansion, growing smaller behind her. She would restore it. That decision settled into her bones like certainty. She would repair the foundation, strip away the hideous wallpaper, bring it back to life. And in the grand foyer, right where it had always belonged, she would hang the antique Gothic mirror. Not as a hiding place anymore, as a monument. A tribute to the woman who taught her the most important lesson she would ever learn. Jade stood on the porch of the Salem estate, drawing the crisp autumn air deep into her lungs. The house was hers now, fully restored, free of its poisoned history. Darius and Sylvia had dissolved into bitter obscurity, crushed beneath the very greed that had blinded them. Sometimes true value isn't found in what glitters the loudest, but in the quiet patience to look closely at what everyone else tosses carelessly aside.